Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn today. I'm Julia Thompson, the Center's Education Program Manager. Today we have with us author Maksim Goldenshteyn, author of So They Remember, a Jewish family story of surviving the Holocaust in Soviet Ukraine. This is our second program in the series, A Summer of Stories. The Holocaust Center for Humanity is located in downtown Seattle. Our museum is open every Sunday right now from 10 to 4. If you haven't visited us before, summer is a great time. You may reserve tickets on our website to explore our permanent exhibit, Finding Light in the Darkness. And when you visit the center, we ask you to consider the original inhabitants of the land on which it stands, the Coast Salish peoples. We honor with gratitude the land itself and those who came before, stewarded the land, and remain leaders and activists within our community. Born in Transnistria, Ukraine, Maksim Goldenshteyn immigrated to the United States with his family in 1992. He grew up in the suburbs of Seattle, studied journalism at the University of Washington, and has written for numerous regional newspapers, including the Seattle Times. Maksim was 23 when he first learned that his grandparents had survived the Holocaust. Growing up, he heard only fragments of their wartime stories, which rarely aligned with the most common depictions of the Holocaust. Goldenshteyn's family lived during World War II in the Romanian-occupied part of Soviet Ukraine, called Transnistria, which included the city of Odessa. This region became a literal killing field where an Axis-aligned Romania carried out the murder of Jews that even Nazi Germany sometimes considered too brutal. And after hundreds of thousands had died, the war had ended, and the Soviet Union took control of the region, the erasure of this Jewish history began. Toward the conclusion of So They Remember, Goldenshteyn describes a publication of Holocaust survivor testimonies from Transnistria, including that of his own grandfather. The book's cover design was striped and reminiscent of concentration camp prisoner uniforms. But the survivors of Transnistria camps and ghettos never wore such uniforms. Goldenshteyn writes, quote, "In their bid to bring awareness to a little-known chapter of the Holocaust, survivors echoed one of the Holocaust's most widely recognized symbols," end quote. How else, perhaps, would their experience be recognized, acknowledged, or understood? This book, So They Remember, is heavy, but it's nonetheless an absolute page-turner, accessible and readable to adults. It reveals strengths and human kindnesses, big and small, beside the abject horrors. In today's presentation, Maksim will trace his family's journey during the 20th century and reflect on how learning about his family's past has taken him on an unexpected journey of his own. Maksim will take questions at the end of the program, so please do type any questions that you have into the Q&A field, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. It's so special to have you, Maksim, Seattle's own author, with us today, and I will pass it to you to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for the kind words and that incredible introduction. I'm honored to be here with you today and grateful for this opportunity to share my story. Before I embark, I just want to also offer a quick thank you to Alana Cohn-Kennedy and Richard Green, both from the museum, for helping put this together and for your help behind the scenes. As someone who's lived here for 30 years now, I feel really fortunate to have an institution like the Holocaust Center for Humanity in our backyard, especially at a time when its mission is more needed than ever. There's a lot to cover, and so without further ado, I'll just go ahead and dive in and share my screen. So I'd like to start not in the 1930s or at the end of the Second World War, but actually in the fall of 1943. The Second World War is still raging, but with a Red Army now on the offensive. And I'd like to start with a couple of images. The one on the right, in particular, is probably the most easily recognized photos of the great Soviet Jewish writer and war correspondent, Vasily Grossman. You might be familiar with some of his novels. And on the left is a portrait taken some years later. Grossman, as a war correspondent, covered the Eastern Front while reporting for the Red Army's newspaper. And while embedded with the Red Army's units, he reported from the front lines and saw some of the most decisive battles up close, and eventually became among the first to document the Holocaust's aftermath. Following the German army's defeat in Kursk, Russia, in the summer of 1943, and with the German forces in retreat, Grossman traveled westward in the Soviet Union as it began to liberate many of the towns and villages where Jewish life once flourished. And as he came to Eastern Ukraine, as his travels brought them there, he encountered very sad and disturbing reality that he had found just one living Jew there. Grossman himself was a native of the city of Berdichev in central Ukraine, and he soon came to realize that his own mother, too, had fallen victim to Nazi atrocities, like thousands of others there. And this led to an article published in the fall of 1943. And here's a snippet translated from the Yiddish language publication. You can certainly read that. It describes, again, this very disturbing reality that he uncovered. Before the war, on the eve of the Holocaust, Ukraine was home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the world. Indeed, on German controlled territory in Ukraine, the vast majority of the Jewish population who found themselves under German occupation were killed. I sometimes wonder to myself what Grossman would have written instead if he had perhaps waited a few more months to file his story, say in mid-1944, when the whole of Soviet Ukraine was liberated by the Red Army as it pushed west. And I wonder what he maybe would have described if his unit had maybe passed through the southwest of Ukraine. And if it did, maybe he would have noticed an anomaly, as some accounts later did, the surprising presence of a large number of Jewish survivors, more than anywhere else in the occupied Soviet Ukraine, specifically 50 to 70,000 of them awaiting their liberation in dozens of camps and ghettos. And here is this particular territory, Transnistria, shaded in gray. This area of southwest Ukraine is today borders Moldova, it was administered or controlled for much of the war, not by the Germans, but by the Romanian allies. Interesting side note, this was the only occupied territory in the Soviet Union controlled by a country other than Germany, except for a small chunk of land that Finland controlled in Russia. And in this relatively unknown territory of Transnistria, Romanian occupied Ukraine, this is the focus of my talk and my book and my family's story. And now I want to kind of travel in time again, this time from 1943 to mid-1992, a few months after the Soviet Union's collapse. This photo was taken almost exactly 30 years ago. It's one of my favorites in our albums. And this is me on the left, sitting on my grandma Anna's lap. I'm almost 4, and we are in our apartment in Chernivtsi, Ukraine, in the southwest of Ukraine, my hometown. My sister's next to me, and next to her is my grandfather Motul, who is really at the center of my book. This was really taken, I think, a couple of months before we were granted refugee status and given permission to leave for the United States in July of 1992. And as some of you know, we were basically part of a large wave of emigration from the Soviet Union that would bring hundreds of thousands of Soviet-born Jews to the US, including thousands to the Seattle area. But I had to say that during the first couple of decades of my life, I didn't really ask a lot of questions about my family's past, like a lot of immigrants. The focus was very much on, learning English, acculturating, making ends meet, building a new future. And looking back was not something that I remember we did much of. This was a photo taken probably in 2006 or 2007. And here again are my maternal grandparents, Motul and Anna. Like my paternal grandparents, they basically helped raise me, and we were all incredibly close. And then, one day, a couple of years after I graduated from college, this would have been in 2012, everything changed for me as I really learned my family's story. So I was visiting my mother Svetlana, and I was just having breakfast at my parents' house, and she mentioned something really in passing about my grandfather saving people during the war. I had no idea what she meant, and so I had already, by this point, done some journalism, including writing for local newspapers. So my first instinct was to just go to my grandparents' house, like I did once in a while anyway, every couple of weeks. But this time I came with a notebook and pen and my phone's recorder ready to go. And I wanted to ask what my mom was talking about. So as I'm sitting there at my grandparents' dining table a decade ago, eating lunch, my grandfather Motul goes back into his bedroom and pulls out a shoebox, and it contains this booklet, which I think Julie alluded to in her opening remarks, and it contains a number of stories and testimonies written by local Holocaust survivors from our hometown in Chernivtsi. And as I sat there, I think it was a Saturday in spring of 2012, my grandfather proceeded to read the part of his written testimony that was published in this booklet. I think it was just a small fraction of what he submitted, but it was a few pages that the editor had chosen to publish. And the opening line of his story here begins this way: "In came the fascists, and the tragedy began." So, as I would later learn over the course of a couple of months, a weekend here, a weekend there, my grandfather and his family were taken from their hometown of Tulchin, Ukraine, in Transnistria's kind of northern reaches, and sent to a death camp in a nearby village. It was established and run not by the Nazis, but by their Romanian allies. This village was called Pechera, and to make matters more confusing, the camp was not guarded by Germans or even by Romanian guards, but by Ukrainian policemen. And it was the Ukrainian people, as I would later learn, who also helped save my family and hundreds and maybe thousands of like them from certain death. What you're looking at here again is the map I showed earlier, Southwest Ukraine during wartime. And as I mentioned, at the heart of the story is Transnistria. Germany basically handed this territory to the Romanians after their conquest of Ukraine in the late summer of 1941, essentially as a thank you to Romania for allying with it in the invasion against the Soviet Union. It was history's largest military operation. Romania contributed oil and nearly 600,000 troops. And you can see that the territory, as Julie mentioned, begins here to the south in the Black Sea, and namely Odessa. Most of the population was concentrated here. It's bounded to the west by the Dniester River and the east by the southern Bug River. The town of, the city, I should say, of Vinnytsia is here. You may have heard of it on the news because it was unfortunately the site of a shelling where a 4-year-old girl was killed, and that made international headlines. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, Vinnytsia was a little bit to the north of Transnistria, which began here on the southern Bug River. So beginning in the fall of 1941, Romania deported here to Transnistria what are generally referred to as Romanian Jews from the provinces of Bessarabia, which is now known as the Republic of Moldova, and also from the northern section of Bukovina here. They deported 150,000 Romanian Jews to Transnistria. And in addition, there were 200,000 local Soviet or Ukrainian Jews who were still living here, for a total of about 350,000 in all. And both these Romanian Jews and local Ukrainian Jews who now found themselves in Transnistria were confined to ghettos and makeshift camps that were established there by the Romanians who now controlled this territory, between 150 and 200 of these concentration sites in total. And often the camps, which there were a handful of, were improvised. There was little regard by the people who had established them for sustaining the populations there. They sometimes comprised little more than pigsties or stables or abandoned houses by war. And the reason why was because there was never really the aim of keeping them there for a long period of time. The aim was to wait until the Germans could make further military progress to the east and in the German-controlled territories, and to then allow the Romanians to deport all of the Jews that were being concentrated here further east into German hands for presumably their mass murder. But of course, that doesn't happen because eventually the Germans begin losing the war and the tides turn. Of the 200,000 Soviet-born Jews born in Transnistria, only about 20,000 survived the Romanian occupation, including members of my family. And of the 150,000 or more Romanian Jews brought here from Bessarabia, from Bukovina, only about 50,000 would survive the war. And now I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about on life before the war in what became Transnistria. This is my grandfather's hometown, Tulchin, Ukraine, and this is a fairly well-known postcard. I think the photo was probably taken 20 or so years before my grandpa was born. It features the market square in Tulchin, then part of the Pale of Settlement in Tsarist Russia. Tulchin is the backdrop for much of my book, and it's where, again, my paternal grandfather and his family were from. On the eve of the Holocaust, here in this town, just under half of the population was Jewish. And they lived in their own enclave in the urban part of town. These communities with a near majority or majority Jewish population, they were called shtetl, or in Russian, they were known as miasteczki. And for most Jews, Yiddish was the first and primary language here. They lived traditional lives. Many Jewish people, were craftsmen, merchants. Some drove horse-drawn carts, whereas the ethnic Ukrainian residents who they shared the town with, they tended to live on the outskirts in the more rural parts, and they were largely engaged in agriculture. But the two groups came together frequently for days like the one you see here on Market Day, where they would trade goods and services. And relations could be quite warm. Many Ukrainians, for example, knew Yiddish. Some Yiddish words made their way into the Ukrainian language. But as many of you know, perhaps from your own family stories, peaceful coexistence from time to time was interrupted by quite horrific violence, beginning notably in the 17th century with the Cossack uprising. Tulchin had actually one of the more famous examples of this, when the town's Jewish population was killed. And pogroms continued in the 19th and early 20th centuries as well, before the Holocaust began. I think it's often also assumed that after the pogroms and after the collapse of the Russian Empire, that many of the Jews who remained here in these borderlands of the former Pale of Settlement simply packed up and left for the big cities of Russia, or I should say of the Soviet Union, or of the West. But the story of my family is actually quite common to many hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who actually remained in these borderland regions. And this is why they were so affected as a result of World War II. My grandfather Motul, who I described earlier, was 12 years old when the German-led invasion began on June 22nd of 1941. He had an older sister named Ethel, who was 14, and they had a younger sister, Manya, who was 5, and a younger brother, Alyova, who was 2. And they lived with their parents, their mothers, Soibel and Edel, in the Jewish neighborhood. This is a photo of a street in Tulchin, which I received from a fantastic librarian. It was taken sometime in the 1940s. On the back, it's written 1948, but it's a little unclear if that's actually when it was taken. You can see some barbed wire here. The librarian speculates maybe this was taken during the time that there was a ghetto in this town, but it's unclear to me. I'm still trying to figure it out. But nonetheless, when German troops entered, they were the first to enter. By that point, many of the Jewish boys and able-bodied men on July 23rd, many by this point had been drafted into the Red Army and had retreated. So this left a town of mostly women, children, and the elderly to fend for themselves. And of the 5,000 or so Jewish people that had once lived in Tulchin, there were around 3,000 remaining. I think something like 30% did try to leave, but most, or to flee the German advance, but most were unable to and had to come back. When the Germans reached Tulchin, it's again on July 23rd, 1941. The German occupation lasts a couple of months. It's quite horrific. And then in late August, the Romanians officially come to control Transnistria. And in September of 1941, they create a ghetto that was put into effect on the high holidays. By this point, typhus epidemics become widespread in Transnistria, as it often does in these kinds of horrific conditions where people are living in cramped quarters. It's difficult to find changes of clothes. More hygiene is not necessarily possible. And an epidemic begins in the Tulchin ghetto as well. And the Romanian authorities panic because they know full well what this looks like from their experience in World War I, and they panic. They don't want it to spread to their troops and to affect their supply lines. So they decide to transfer the town's Jewish population of around, again, 3,000 to a newly created death camp. And this is called a death camp by historians, about 35 kilometers or 20-something miles away. And this was in a way to quarantine them, for lack of a better word. And so in December of 1941, Tulchin's Jews were forced onto the street in this ghetto, very close to where this photo was taken, possibly on this very street. And they were funneled into this school that you see here. It was a primary school called School Number 1. And they were forced inside for 3 days without food or water before they were then sent on a brutal 3-day march to the village of Pechera during what was the coldest, or one of the coldest winters of the 20th century in Europe. So they're marched into this village by the Romanian military police called the gendarmes, after having spent 2 nights in an open field and a barn. And they're basically carrying only the food and other items and clothes that they could bring with them in their hands as they're wading through deep mud, and in many cases having to carry small children in their arms. Some elderly folks are able to keep up and perish along the way. Many people are killed for not being able to keep up. Before World War II, and it continues to be to this day, Pechera was an idyllic village. It still is. It's a beautiful place. It's located. It was located on the very northern edge of Transnistria. Interestingly, across the river, which you can see, the Southern Blue River, which you can see here, this delineated Romanian-controlled territory to the west from what was German-controlled territory in Ukraine. And again, the ultimate aim was to, when military progress allowed, to transfer everyone to the German-controlled side. But again, that would never happen. And so the folks were left here to find shelter wherever they could for what became a 2.5-year ordeal. Many people chose this building on these grounds. This was actually a former sanitarium building used for tuberculosis treatment. There were some stables and other kinds of shelter that people found, but in general, it was quite horrific, and effectively they were left to their own devices without much much of anything. There was no food, there was no water provided. They only had the clothes on their backs. A quick side note, this hospital, or these grounds, while it was a death camp during the war, they continue to serve as a hospital to this day, which is a kind of a disturbing history. But it's fairly typical, I would say, of the former Holocaust sites in Transnistria. Often there's very little to tell people who are unfamiliar with the history what exactly the role of this place was during the war. And so in December of 1941, when Tulchin's Jewish population arrives, they come through this gate and down this alley, and they find that the makeshift camp is basically surrounded by stone walls and gates. Much of the wall today is gone. You can just only see these kind of support posts here. But outside of the walls and in front of the gates, the camp was guarded by, as I mentioned earlier, Ukrainian policemen. Who were these policemen, and why were they helping the Romanian and German occupiers? It's a sensitive question that I think has only been broached fairly recently by historians. And the answer is that in Romanian-occupied Ukraine, many thousands of Ukrainian men collaborated with the occupiers. Many of them were basically captured POWs from the Red Army, who agreed to return to their hometowns to serve the Romanians, whether as guards or laborers on farms, because there was a shortage. And if you're interested in more on this, historian Vladimir Solinari has done some remarkable work on this topic. But basically, they agreed to do this because it was often a way to avoid the brutality and death of Soviet POW camps. Many decades later, the child survivors of this camp would remember their names. These men who guarded them, often brutalized and sometimes killed them. There was the Mishka from Odessa, Mishka with a Cossack hat. And maybe the most famous one of all was a guy named Smetansky. And again, he was remembered many decades later by name. And of course, it doesn't take long for the prisoners to realize that there is no food here, that there's no water, and they're effectively being starved. And about all they can do is trade the goods that they have with them for food with the villagers who stand outside the gates, and what becomes kind of an informal bazaar. And in some occasions, many of the villagers often, hear and see quite clearly and easily what's happening, and so the villagers in Pechera begin lobbing food over the camp walls or simply handing it to people to try to help. And I think what's worth emphasizing here is that the camp is quite porous with low walls. The walls are missing here, but here you can see what remains. In some places, it was 6-7 feet high. So, unlike the hermetically sealed ghettos that we often think of in Poland, for example, it was quite possible to see, hear what was happening, even to escape. And soon, many more Jews arrive in the camp from nearby towns and villages, even from as far as Bessarabia and Bukovina. And the dwellings become even more cramped. Prisoners are packed onto the floor, 40 or 50 people in given rooms in the large building. And disease proliferates, typhus and others, and starvation as well. My grandfather and his 3 siblings all contracted typhus, but miraculously, they weren't really sure how, but they were able to eventually recover. And then many children like them, especially in the winter of 1942, begin to realize that without food and with dwindling clothes and other things that they've traded away, that there's really only one way to survive. And that's to ask their families and their parents for permission to escape the camp and to beg for food in Pechera and other villages nearby. Often they've seen other kids do it. They've heard about other kids do it. And maybe while some of these kids never return or return having been badly beaten, many do slip back into the camp carrying sacks of food. And so this becomes quite a well-known phenomenon, and it's something that a variety of historians have written about when describing Transnistria. But really, this becomes for many children a burden of being responsible for allowing their families to survive the war. And it's often the children that are sent on these dangerous missions because, in fact, many parents are obviously taking care of small siblings or maybe older relatives. I mentioned earlier, the walls are quite high, but in other places, it's well-known places, it's 6 or 7 feet high. So children who are 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 are able to scale them. Some begin to travel alone to outlying villages, some in groups. And they notice patterns in the ways that the Ukrainian policemen operate. Often they're patrolling by day, but then by early evening they've retreated to their warm huts, and often they drink heavily, and so they're pretty much absent from their posts, and it becomes quite easy to slip out. Initially, the children show up on the doors of villagers in Pechera, but over time they begin, like my grandfather and his sister, to travel to further away villages because there's less competition for food there. In many cases, these are dangerous journeys, often in sub-zero weather. They're wearing basically rags. And the Ukrainians in the countryside take these children in. Sometimes they let them stay the night. Sometimes they let them warm up on their ovens, because back then they had these kind of brick ovens that you could lay on. And often they would bring them or allow them to take sacks of food home to their families. Sometimes these children would routinely visit the same family for help, as was the case for my own grandfather, who kind of created this network of people who we had come to befriend over a period of 2.5 years or so that helped save our family. The best estimate, and I'm skipping over a lot, of course, but the best estimate I've seen is that of the 11,000 people or so that are eventually sent to this camp, about 9,500 perish, or about 80 or 90%. The war would take a decisive turn starting in late 1942, even before the disastrous defeat for the Germans and Romanians at Stalingrad. The Romanians, their policy begins to shift in Transnistria. They become very much aware that if the Soviets win the war, which looks increasingly likely, they'll be punished for their crimes, and their approach moderates. So in Pechera, child prisoners who, like my grandfather, have been escaping the camp for some time to return to their families for food. Now they sense that it's even safer to travel outside the camp. And they begin to reach more far-flung ghettos, places where mostly Romanian Jews are imprisoned. And they discover there that while the conditions are quite horrific, they offer a vast improvement over life in the camp. And the word quickly spreads about this. And the consensus seems to be that it would be far safer to live out the war there, where the Romanian Jews have often set up canteens where food and medicine and clothes have been sent by the Jewish community in Romania proper, and where there is less of a risk of being taken away for slave labor. And so slowly over time, those who manage to survive the camp are able to leave for what are considered relatively safer ghettos. And that's how my grandfather basically decided to, well, I should back up and say, fellow Jewish prisoners in the camp begin to ask my grandfather, who has turned 14 by this time and who's now developed these networks, to help bring them to what they perceive as these safer ghettos. And they pay him in food and money for smuggling them there. And in turn, he ends up saving people who well may have otherwise died of hunger in Pechera. Sometimes he carries messages between the camps and ghettos for payment, and sometimes he helps other families communicate. And so slowly, as I mentioned, by the spring of 1943, most of the remaining survivors, not all, save for a few hundred, begin to leave the camp and escape into the ghettos of northern Transnistria. Eventually, my grandfather managed to convince his mother, who was pretty stubborn, to let him take her and his siblings to the Jarin ghetto in the northwest of Transnistria, where they stay for the last year of the war, March 1943 until March 1944, when they are finally liberated by the Red Army. His father Idil and his grandfather, however, perished during the war. As mentioned, in March 1944, the Red Army enters and begins to liberate Transnistria's camps and ghettos. As mentioned, of the survivors in Pechera who remain until the end, only 300 to 400 saw the liberation there. And for me, describing this in the book, the scene of liberation by the Red Army was, I think, especially moving because the camp was liberated by a Yiddish-speaking Red Army captain who happened to be Jewish, and who is pictured here on this slide. And he would eventually write about this experience of speaking in Yiddish to assure the prisoners that he encountered that he was there to help them. And his letters to one of the survivors describing this can be found in the Vinnytsia region archives today. His name was Boris Naiman, and as you can see, he was incredibly young. For many Red Army soldiers like him, they encountered very few living Jewish survivors in Ukraine as they traveled east to west. But it was really only in Transnistria where some of the communities remained intact, because again, the Romanian dictator Antonescu was never able to send surviving Jews across the Bu River and into German hands for what would have been certain death. Similarly, during the liberation of the nearby ghetto that my grandfather had helped his family escape to, there was also a Jewish Red Army captain. And in this case, that Red Army captain had managed to liberate his own father from the ghetto. So after the spring of 1944, the Romanian Jewish survivors, about 50,000 of them, are able to be repatriated back into Romania. Eventually, they would, most of them would end up in Israel within a couple of decades. For Soviet Jewish survivors, many of them children, mothers, the elderly, they're basically free to walk back to their hometowns, let's say 10, 15, 30 miles away for those who are in camps. And many would remain in their hometowns, either for the rest of their lives or for decades until eventually emigrating. But when they first returned to their hometowns in the spring of 43, there's no guidance on what to do and where to go. And what they discover is that often in the old Jewish neighborhoods in which they've grown up, almost all of the houses are destroyed and they're taken apart for firewood. And this was the case in Tulchin when my grandfather, at the age of, I believe it would have been about 15, when he led his family back to Tulchin from the camp for the first time. So, what do they do without anywhere to sleep that night? Well, my grandfather, as he tells it, and as my great aunt told me, he basically, led them through the town. And oops, my apologies. He led them through the town, and he basically walked on this street beside one of the most recognizable landmarks in Tulchin, the Cathedral of Christ Nativity. Across the street, he found an empty shack, and once he realized that no one was inside, he basically went around the back, tore off a lock, and welcomed his family inside. It was a one-room house. There was no electricity, no running water, no outhouse even, and it used to be located many decades ago here between these two apartment complexes, but obviously has since been razed. I think this highlights the fact that in the Soviet Union there was a major housing crisis, and for many survivors who returned to their towns, it would be a couple of decades actually until they could even get proper housing in the apartment blocks that would rise, particularly in the 1960s. It was here in this one-room shack that I mentioned that my grandmother Anna would move into when she married my grandfather in the late 50s. And it's here where my mother and uncle lived for their first years of their lives, and again in this one-room shack until they were able to receive permission to move into an apartment. But now, I think going back briefly to 1944, I think it's fair to say that the Holocaust, of course, had an indelible impact on the identity of the Jewish people who managed to survive and return. It wasn't just, the demographic fact that most Jews had been killed, and that many fathers, brothers, friends, husbands had been killed fighting in the Red Army. But it was the fact that, once they had constituted nearly half the population, now they were vastly outnumbered by Ukrainian residents. They now lived among Ukrainians rather than in their own neighborhoods. Many survivors and their families talked later about growing self-conscious about their Jewish identities and their speech as a result. Some began to speak Yiddish only in private. Some renounced their names. Jeffrey Weidlinger, scholar of the post-war shtetls of Ukraine's Vinnytsia province, as it's called today, writes that, quote, the Yiddish speech that had echoed through the market squares for generations was silenced overnight. When sound returned, it was overwhelmingly in Ukrainian, forever transforming the oral landscape. And here's a photo of a monument that stands near the mass graves just outside of the Pechera camp where many of the victims were buried. It's in a wooded clearing with 3 or 4 trenches behind it. And depending on the source you consult, it was probably erected by survivors in the immediate post-war years when it was more possible to do that. And thinking about the post-war period in the Soviet Union, as it relates to the Holocaust, I think one of the more complex questions continues to be, to what extent were people permitted to talk about and remember the Holocaust? What was known and not known? Was there a single policy banning its discussion and memorialization? And I think the consensus now seems to be that there wasn't a total ban, contrary to what many people imagine. And I think that's surprising because many people are familiar with Baba Yar, and the fact that it took until 1976 for a monument to be placed there. But thanks to historian Arkady Zeltser, we know that something like 700 different groups across the Soviet Union came together to build monuments like this, despite the fact that they had to appeal to local authorities to do so, sometimes at personal risk. And they did this to honor their loved ones or communities of survivors that were lost. And I thought it was really important when writing and researching the book to delve into this, to not only describe the plight of survivors, but also of the people who after the war fought to preserve the memory of what had happened. And I think in general, this fits within the Jewish tradition of Herban, I believe that's how you pronounce, which means destruction, and which deals with the tradition of preserving the memory of past catastrophes. But nonetheless, the topic of the Holocaust was taboo in Soviet Ukraine and throughout the Soviet Union. And the official narrative in the Soviet Union was that all Soviet citizens suffered equally. The fact that Jews were specifically targeted for complete annihilation wasn't acknowledged. And as survivors tell it, to say otherwise, to talk about one's own story, was to invite ridicule in social settings, potentially to risk getting fired from one's job or university, and so on. And so many people just remained quiet for decades until, let's say, the 1980s, or the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when it was more possible to speak out about one's experiences. I also just wanted to zoom in on the monument from the previous slide to show two photos that were mounted onto it, and they show they're photos of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising heroes, which is a story that was quite well known in the Soviet Union. And so in many ways, again, the monument is also pushing back against the notion that Jews were passive victims, which was very much the Soviet narrative. And I think the story of the child survivors of Pechera is a testament to this, and I think that's worth highlighting. But I also want to say that even with the existence of this memorial, this is basically located in kind of this out-of-the-way clearing in the woods. Most people would not know how to find it. And so the Pechera camp itself was not even marked as a death camp or a Holocaust site until 1989. So we're talking about the very end of the Soviet era. And I'll show you how it was marked in just a minute. But unbeknownst to most people, the grounds continued to operate and after the war as a hospital, as a health clinic, as a health resort, with very few traces of its wartime history. So I realize I'm coming up against the end of the presentation, so I'll quickly go through some family photos, because I realize I haven't shown you many photos of what the people in the book or the story look like. So here's my grandfather Motul. This, I think, is one of the earliest photos of him that I have. It's him right after he joined the Red Army and was conscripted, and he was serving in Brest, in Belarus. And this is my grandfather Motul. This is his older sister Etol, his younger sister Manya, sometime right after the war. This photo was taken in 1957. This is one of my favorite photos, and it takes place on the Southern Bug River, and what you see out of frame is probably the stairs leading to what had been the former site of the camp. And this is one of my favorite photos, not just because it's surprisingly well composed, but also because obviously the beauty of the river and the rocks behind it, but also because I think this was probably one of the more special times in my grandparents' lives. This was taken right after my grandfather Motul, who's here, had met my grandmother Anna, who's here, and the reason why he was visiting Pechera was because this is where my grandmother Anna, this is where her family was from before the war, and so he was basically visiting her family after the war, during their courtship phase, and it was actually on this trip, and possibly on a different trip, but very likely on this trip during which this photo was taken, that my grandfather had an encounter with one of the former camp guards, which I write about in the book. One of the things that might be surprising to hear is that, of all the countries occupied by the Nazis or their allies during the war, the Soviets arrested and convicted more suspected collaborators than any other country, about 300,000 or so. But after Stalin's death and this sort of brief thaw, many of these sentences were commuted. And so by the 1950s, some of these former camp guards collaborators, they would simply returned to their hometowns and often the very places where they had served during the war, and attempted to reintegrate themselves into society. And so these kinds of run-ins were quite common, and unfortunately were one of the many unfortunate post-war realities for survivors. Really quickly, my grandfather is here, and my grandmother were married in, I believe, 1957. My uncle, Igor, who's here, was born a year later. My mother, again, in 1964. And, as far as Jewish life in post-war Tulchin, where my family continued to live, my grandparents, who were born in the 1920s, 1930s, they were part of a generation of Soviet-born Jews, in which Judaism was really separated from Jewishness. Soviet authorities denigrated and discouraged religion, and so many of the traditions that my grandmother and grandfather had learned from their parents and grandparents were no longer transmitted. My mother, for example, recalled that something as simple as celebrating Passover and attempting to buy matzah would involve having to sneak over to a neighbor's house in the dark with pillowcases so they could bring the matzah home. So that was the sort of atmosphere that they lived in. As I mentioned earlier, it would take until 1989 for the late Soviet government to recognize that the Pechera camp had existed, and they did so with a ceremony and by erecting this plaque. As was the norm in the Soviet Union, the text of the plaque, which is in Ukrainian, obfuscated the fact that the victims themselves were Jewish. In the Soviet Union, there was a euphemism often used in these sort of contexts that called Jewish victims and survivors peaceful Soviet citizens, which of course hid the fact that they were specifically targeted for being Jews. But I should note that in the post-Soviet period, the plaque's wording has been changed or had been changed to indicate the Jewish identities of the victims. Okay, and now in closing, I just want to end with another of my favorite photos. This is of my grandfather Motul and my grandmother Anna at their favorite kind of spot in Seattle back when they lived there. This is Cary Park in our gorgeous Queen Anne neighborhood. It's an iconic viewpoint for those who aren't from Seattle. It's and this photo was taken about 20 years ago. I also want to say that my grandmother is still with us today. I think what my grandparents would probably say about the Holocaust was that it's not what defined them, but it did define the arc of their lives. And they defined themselves, I think, as providers and as people who really did everything for their family. They were devoted. As far as my own journey, I think it began with the feeling of needing to give voice to Soviet Jewish survivors who we don't necessarily hear from. But when I began to reflect on my family's story and the story of Jewish life in this part of southern Ukraine, I realized that I was really tracing my family's journey across the arc of the 20th century, a time of radical change, violence, and often the loss of Jewish identity and culture. And so I think moving forward for my own life and family, I think this knowledge will be instructive in the way I move forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maksim, so much for sharing some snippets of your story, your book. There's so much to discuss and unpack, and I hope that listeners, you feel free to type in any questions, but I can certainly start off with a few of my own. And I know you sort of begin your book describing a bit about the kind of discovery when your grandparents share a bit about their past during the Holocaust era. I'm wondering if you could tell our audience what your initial reactions were upon learning about this.
Yeah, Julie, thank you for that question. I would say that it was a total shock, and the reason why is because I never really heard of their stories framed as being from the Holocaust. I wrote in the book that one of the stories that my grandmother Anna told me while growing up was of her as a child, basically walking out of a ghetto because she was missing her toys, and so she retrieved them at her old home. Her former neighbors saw her, handed her a bag of food, and helped her come back. And I just, the idea that this was somehow related to the Holocaust, I never connected those dots because my grandmother never used that vocabulary. It was somewhat foreign to her, given her context. So I heard other stories like that too, and it never really clicked for me. So again, this was a shock, and was very much, and the content of the story very much, I think, stood in contrast to what I had read in books and movies, and to many of the other types of mediums where the Holocaust is portrayed.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you for sharing. I also wanted to touch on something that I noticed time and again in the book and sort of alluded to earlier, which was the actions, whether tiny or a bit bigger, of folks helping each other during this extremely difficult time. And of course, we see that in many parts of the Holocaust in many regions. I'm just wondering if you know of or have heard of any type of recognition for some of these, helpers in Transnistria region, whether they've received the Righteous Among the Nations designation, or, any other kind of acknowledgement post-war.
That's a great question. What I can say is that the mayor of my hometown, the Romanian wartime mayor, was the first Romanian, I believe, to be named Righteous Among the Nations, sort of honoree for his actions. But I have to tell you, I think the total number of Ukrainian, people who are recognized, I think, is only a couple of thousand. And I don't know specifically how many of those have been honored for their role in Transnistria. But what I can tell you is my assumption is that 2,000 is a vast undercount. If we think about the pre-war population, or the population of Transnistria, the local population on the eve of the Holocaust, it was 300,000. It ended up being 200,000 because some people were drafted into the Red Army, some people fled. But anyway, if it's 200,000 and about 10% survive, that's 20,000 people who probably in some way were helped along the way. So I tend to think it's probably more people than we know. But what I will say is that the phenomenon is a little bit unique to Transnistria. There were other parts of what we now consider Ukraine where there were sort of spontaneous pogroms that happened, where the locals actually in large numbers aided the occupiers and other collaborators in violence. And there's all kinds of theories about why this happened, but I think there's also a sense from historians that in parts of Ukraine that were in the Soviet Union for a while, like let's say 2 decades, there had been before the war policies of integration of kind of propaganda that promoted positive images of Jews, that actually that helped bridge some of the gaps and helped correct some of the misperceptions that people had, and some of and basically, to summarize, basically, it resulted in a wide number of people actually stepping up to help their neighbors, which again is not something you see in a lot of other regions of Ukraine, especially those that, for example, the Soviet Union had occupied in 1939, where there really was no time for some of these policies to take place.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, a very kind of unique region in many ways, and we know that it's not easy to receive that Righteous Among the Nations designation either. There are like hoops to jump through to get this kind of bureaucratic stamp that, yes, this person helped save Jewish lives. And so there's so many unnamed people and so many actions that contributed to people's survival. Okay, a couple more questions coming into the chat. Someone is wondering if you could share some, I believe, titles of Vasily Grossman's works, or whether he wrote about the events in Transnistria.
Yeah, I actually don't think he wrote much about the events of Transnistria. I would say, he did write a lot about other sites that he saw. For example, Treblinka. He was one of the first to really document what happened there, and even considering how early it was, I think this was still during the war. He got a lot of facts about it right. Um, Again, he covered a lot about he covered a lot of the major battles that happened during the war, and I think he's probably best known, for a couple of novels which again tackle Soviet life and the military during the war. Namely, maybe his book about Stalingrad, I think. But yeah, I think he's definitely, especially now, recognized as maybe one of the leading Russian language writers of all time. Although interestingly, my understanding is that's not necessarily the case in Russia itself, but I think outside of Russia, I think he's widely recognized.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get to a few more quick questions before we wrap up. And one is whether you've been able to visit your hometown of Chernivtsi since you have immigrated to the United States.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Most of my relatives left immediately as soon as we were able to, for a variety of reasons. When I received the book contract for this, it was February of 2020, and so immediately I booked my plane tickets. And unfortunately, the pandemic prevented me from going. And then I was going to do it again, and unfortunately now the war broke out. So no, I haven't been able to return, and I don't think anyone in my family has either. So it's something I'll hopefully get to do in the future.
That's so bittersweet, really. The success of this book and learning more in recent years has been so powerful for you, I'm assuming, but you just can't get back quite yet. So I hope that happens.
Yeah. Me too.
There's some great questions that have just come in, which I regret we won't have time to cover, but if you're willing, I may email them to you.
Oh, absolutely.
For you to address, and we can try to send them back to the folks who posed them. I just want to know before we say goodbye and conclude, I'm just curious what projects you have next on the table, if anything. Is there a research topic or something that you're working on after this book?
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for that question. Recently I was invited to participate in a working group by a very prominent research organization called the Society for Romanian Studies. It's filled with leading scholars of the Holocaust in Romania, and it's a working group devoted to the memory of the Second World War. So I think it's still an emerging area, but I'm interested to see what might happen there, and some collaborative work that might come of that. Otherwise, I think this was pretty taxing on me, especially because, with a couple of small kids and having to work mostly nights. So I feel like I'm still physically and emotionally and mentally recovering from the work. And so I might, I think I'll probably take a break from the topic for a bit. And who knows, maybe dive into something soon, though.
Of course, a well-deserved break is in order. Well, Max, thank you so much for your time. I really cannot begin to imagine how proud your family must be of the work you've done to share this history and, just be the uncoverer of so many individuals' resilience and their survival. So thank you very much for joining us today for this Lunch and Learn. I hope that folks listening go out and find Max's book, which is published by the University of Oklahoma Press. And Richard put the full title in the chat for those who need it.
Thank you all so much. It was an honor.
Thanks again. I also want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who ran the technical side of this show. And thanks to each and every one of the Holocaust Center staff members and interns who make these programs run smoothly. Dee Simon, Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, Paul Regelbrug, Jessica Michaels, Lori Warshall-Cohen, Amanda Davis, Katie Lawrence, Morgan Romero, Devonshire Lockie, And our interns right now, Zane Hall, Bridget Wilson, Kiana Nasrabadi, and Mia Cohen. Thank you to our 2022 Lunch and Learn series sponsors, the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation and the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. And I hope you'll please come back in 2 weeks for our next virtual Lunch and Learn with Diane Su, author of a biography about beloved Holocaust survivor, educator, and a longtime Bellingham, Washington resident, Noemi Vaughn. That's Tuesday, August 16th on Zoom and Facebook Live, again with author Diane Su. Thank you so much, and this concludes our program today.